So I will first invite Dr. Jiang to make her opening remarks in about 3 or 4 minutes. Dr. Jiang, a pleasure to have you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chandran, and thanks to Gift for the invitation. I'm very happy to join the conversation, and partly because this is organized in Asia, but to a global audience. I'm a researcher of political economy of China, and in recent years, I've been studying China's development cooperation with developing countries. I think, Chandran, you have raised some very important issues that concerns international peace and especially conflict. And from my angle, development as diplomacy has been a very important principle, as well as instrument in China's diplomacy and its worldview. My main points are that China thinks that the Western-led so-called global order has too much emphasis on ideology and security. And the result is a division between different types of countries and conflict. So China has actually helped to bring development to the forestage, not at the backstage of global issues. And that is the wish of many countries in the global south. And that is actually a reality of the domestic politics of many Western countries that led to domestic tensions. And the second point is that China sees the root cause of conflict often in poverty and inequality. And China has a good economic relations, the biggest market and investor in many countries. And that's why China can play the role of a mediator. For example, China can bring Iran and Saudi Arabia in the same forum. China can shake hands with both Cambodia and Thailand and help to mediate their border conflict. And China can be a leader in several multilateral organizations. And in this new age of green transition and technology, fourth wave of technology revolution, China's way of cooperating with developing countries has been different from Western countries. And that has increased the influence of China and inspired Western countries to change its way gradually, slowly, of how they treat developing countries. China advocates equal partnerships and joint advancement. So often there is no strings attached about democracy, about you have to open up your capital account or release your currency. And there are no lectures about feminism, as Africans complain, but listen to what host countries demand and try to satisfy those demands. And instead of providing those Western formats so that those host countries can satisfy. And especially China has been more willing to share technology in IT, in AI, in green transition, so they can become new growth engines instead of liabilities, instead of costs, instead of an alternative to economic development, because jobs and growth are still very important to developing countries. And China is showing that we can provide you with skills training, we can invest and provide technology transfer so that developing countries together with China can climb up the value chain. And that has been a fundamental reason of inequality between the Western world and the global South. Thank you.
Dr. Jiang, thank you. Wonderful. I just going to ask you for a quick response to the question. What do you say to the cynics and even the critics of China who says, oh, yes, it all sounds good, but they're really in there in Africa, Southeast Asia, etc., to have a long-lasting power and take over resources, etc. Because you made it very clear that there's a very different philosophy. It's not imperial, Pankaj talked about. So what do you say to those people who can't believe that any big power can behave in this manner, and particularly, rooted in this view that development is progress, and if you alleviate poverty and you address those, then you prevent more conflict. In 30 to 40 seconds, please.
Totally relevant question, and I hear it often here in Europe. And they don't see development as equal. Often Westerners think we provide aid and it's kind of condescending. But China has shown that, it has grown. If countries complain, you're just here for resources. then China may help building a refinery there. It can help with building a factory there. And both China, and not just China, but also Japan, South Korea, Gulf countries, they are trying to show that this could be a win-win process. And it doesn't have to be kind of predatory and exploitative.
Thank you. Let's come back later to this topic of predatory and exploitative, because sometimes that happens even inadvertently. So what's the risk of China becoming, be seen as predatory and exploitative? I'd like to come back to that as well, because I think that'd be good advice for the Chinese officials and all who are listening as well. So our next panelist is Dr. Jen. Dr. Jen, a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for making the time. You're based in China. You're a distinguished academic at the Chinese Institute of International Studies. Can you please share with us your take on the topic of this panel, please?
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm very glad to be here to share my views. Different from the former speaker from the development perspective. I'm actually been involving European studies for more than 20 years. So I try to explain Chinese position and its policy orientation in the crisis management area. So I totally agree with you in your introduction. Chinese foreign policy actually was deeply rooted in its history, its culture, and of course, it is evolving in the changing global context. So starting from this point, you could easily see China's policy or a kind of positions in the so-called crisis management area. I think the first and the foremost principle is the non-intervention principle, or in other words, to respect the sovereignty principle. During the long-term debates as regards to the issue of humanitarian intervention, China always, are very cautious of that kind of intervention, because generally it will cause more, humanitarian crises instead. So here is a very different perspective from Chinese side. And secondly, it's very interesting. If you follow the debate, another issue related to the humanitarian intervention, that is a so-called responsibility to protect. But, after the Libyan crisis, Chinese, there is a lot of views to express the so-called responsible protection, because the responsibility to protect always have a kind of blurred line, where the gray zones will be easily crossed. That has been a kind of instrument to intervene the sovereignty and integrity of the territory. This is the second point I'd like to share. The third one actually is China generally favor the political dialogues, the diplomacy as an instrument for mediating or for the crisis management instead of sanctions. So you could see China's position in a lot of issues, such as the ways in engaging in the Iranian nuclear crisis, and also today in handling the Ukrainian crisis. We always, keep on that very basic point. And also, with the increasing influence of China in the world, China actually has adapted itself to the world. There is a kind of so-called constructive engagement or constructive intervention in solving the crisis, such as the role we played, especially the year before last year, of the reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So here, China has been trusted by the two sides, and China is an objective mediator. That is why it's China to have this kind of role. And fundamentally speaking, China holds a kind of security perspective from the ones like these security should be realized in a cooperative one. They should be a kind of comprehensive and a long-term sustainable security. all of these views, all of this actually was based on Chinese understanding of the development and the security nexus. If we follow Chinese own development, we always emphasize this kind of nexus. But compared with Chinese ones, I think European has long considered there is a kind of nexus between good governance and security that put the good governance as a precondition for security, that make it, to put the so-called rule of law, human rights, and democracy, of course, Western style of democracy, as a precondition for security. That make them more possible to impose sanctions or to put conditionalities in crisis management. Of course, with all of that differences, there are also similarities between China and the EU. I think that lay the foundation for the future cooperation, especially under current disrupted world order. The first one, I think, in crisis management, EU also preferred or to put the so-called UN mandate as a precondition for any intervention or any engagement. The second one is EU is also would like to see multilateral ways to engage in the crisis. And also both China and EU emphasize the role of regional organizations in the process. So even today, China and the EU are experiencing some difficulties in the bilateral relations, but I still think in multilateral area, under the background of the unilateral measures taken by Trump, the second administration, there's still a huge space to explore. So I think I like to stop here and more questions will be welcomed. Thank you.
Dr. Jin, thank you. Very good 5 points there, 4 points there. One quick question and a quick response, if you don't mind. When you talk about constructive engagement, very often that is criticized as being appeasement. I'm sure you've been challenged in that way. And also when you talk about China as an objective mediator, again, in the sort of global sort of mainstream media, geopolitical industry, as Pankaj talked about, that is seen as also as a laughable suggestion. How do you respond to those things that, constructive engagement is actually appeasement, and that the idea that China can be an objective mediator is laughable, though, the irony is no one questions whether the European Union or the United States can be objective either. Very quickly, if you could respond to that, please.
I think, of course, different actors will hold different views as regards to Chinese behavior in the world. But I don't agree with that constructive engagement is a kind of appeasement. I think Chinese constructive engagement is following the international law, which is most of them are presented under the UN Charter. So I could cite the example of Chinese position in the current Ukrainian conflict. I think there is a historical dimension needed to take into consideration in order to solve the conflict, because the current situation is a typical security dilemma for the two sides. So only with these historical views it could be solved. So it's not a kind of appeasement. I think it's a solution with long-term, or sustainable solution oriented without taking sides of the conflict. I think to be objectivity is purpose of this Chinese perception.
If I interpret that, and it also, I think, reflects my view, the Chinese view is to essentially not put more oil in the fire and to actually avoid an escalation of conflict and don't make perfect the enemy of a better solution where there's, you can reduce things first and then begin the dialogue. So thank you very much. So our third speaker, who is Palestinian, Dr. Tate, welcomed, and I hope you don't mind me saying that you're a Palestinian. I know you live in Europe, but I'm sure you have family back home, and I hope, I'm sure there's been a great deal of suffering, but our thoughts are with you and your people. So, but thank you for taking time to come here. Over to you as someone who's Palestinian, who's, you know, in everyone's mind, what's going on in your homeland, and then, you know, this topic of China as a balancer, etc. I'm sure lots of people would like to hear what you have to say. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind invitation and for having me here and for putting this together. Indeed, I'm Palestinian, but I will put also my analytical hat in here because I would like to step out of this and just reflect and put on the table here two arguments. And here I'm speaking from my positionality, looking at China through Middle East region, through Middle East and North Africa region. And the previous two panelists highlighted many issues that are relevant to the region. So, but here I would like to put two arguments. The main question to me here is, where are China's strategic priorities? Certainly, there is a strategic interest in the Middle East and North Africa region when it comes to China, and to be more precise, in the Gulf and in the GCC countries. But there is a big difference between strategic interest and strategic priority for a global power like China. So first argument is, how do we deal with this distinction between these two concepts? The second one, which goes back to the original question of this conference and conversation, does China's role and model offer a viable alternative for global leadership? My answer is yes, if China wants. And that's, I know it's a difficult one to answer, but look at this from the Middle East perspective, I don't see enough willingness to lead the global leadership. I see many other things. I see fantastic economic partnerships. I see diplomatic breakthroughs like the one between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But I also see lots of transactional politics. I see lots of carefully calculated political steps there with one headline, which says, let us offer the Middle East, the Gulf in particular, a signal that, hello countries, you can look east. You have an attractive partner there, but we don't want to impose ourselves on you as the US is doing. And I think this is a very significant message that we have there. Here, the counter argument to all of this is how this China's approach towards the Middle East, which is balances ambition with caution at the same time. How is that manifested and articulated out there? Because the counter argument to this, that we're doing so many things in the background, and that is better, as many Chinese policymakers told me. We don't want to be too visible and too loud. But then where do we bring in the question of perception? If you want to be a global leader, the people from the global majority wants to see you that you're leading. You're showing that leadership, which is not enough in the case of the Middle East. There are so many explanations, but I wish I can say more about the development approach of China when it comes to the Middle East. It's not visible enough. What is visible is the relationship vis-a-vis the Gulf. And these are not developing countries. So it's not that China is bringing its development model to the Gulf countries. No. Here we're talking about very clear economic partnerships that we can look through that when we explain what this relationship. And there are multiple ways to look at it, especially when we think that China is a major economic partner for most of the region. China registered an impressive 360 billion in trade with the region in 2022. The US was only 144 billion. So we're talking about major economic leverage, if you like. We're talking about the regions, the Middle East supplied almost half of total crude oil imports to China. So we have major entry points, and more than entry points, but major leverages to be used. But here, how do we understand all of that? It can be understood through that China is keeping low profile to this complex relationship, but also building on the economic aspects of things. And the second way to look at it is, from a China point of view, no, we need to do a little bit more because there is a geostrategic location to the region, and this is why it's been upping in the priorities of China, but not enough. But finally, there is also a tension between being a global leader and not doing enough, and that's something that offers another explanation when it comes to China's intervention in the region. And after all, it is really how does China like to articulate its intervention vis-a-vis the US in the region. I think this is really crucial, and if we ignore that, then we're not addressing the point, because China is ultimately a cautious power that made significant strides through its low-profile, incremental, but also commercially driven approach to the region, and will likely favor long-term, patient, quiet, carefully calibrated approach that relies on initiatives but also institutions. So that's also to be seen. But in my minute that is left here, okay, one word on Palestine and one word on Gaza. Thinking a lot about it, I also came to the conclusion that we need to ask one question: can or is China interested in clashing with the US over Palestine? I think for me, this is the bottom line, because China has to be selective in its priorities and in the battles that it wants to choose. Would it choose Palestine and Gaza to show global leadership or not? So far, in full honesty, I don't think it did over the past 2 years. It did so many steps, took so many steps, so many declarations, but not enough to show that it can offer a viable partner. Here are 3 examples. It didn't, for example, offer a new coalition for reconstruction, for peace mediation, for development, although it did micro steps. It brought the Palestinian factions together to China. It, of course, did the Saudi-Iran mediation. So it's showing us that it can, if it wants. But then there is this question of offering a larger image of leadership when it comes to Palestine or not. And linking to what Banker said and the conversation earlier today, is China interested in investing in reinventing global governance institutions? Because how that has direct impact on Palestine. If it is really interested in not reforming, not reconfiguring, but really reimagining, reinventing global institutions, I argue that that will have a direct trickle-down effect on Gaza and on Palestine. And finally, is China interested in putting firm and solid sanctions on Israel to lead the world by example? When we talk about accountability, when we talk about globalship, then China needs to show a leadership that matters for global peace. And sanctions at this moment is a key word that China needs to entertain. The question if it will take that offer and show leadership by example.
Dr. Tate, brilliant. Thank you so much, particularly bringing in the Middle Eastern context. But I think the more very important message that you said, does China want to? It can if it wants to, I think is what you were basically said. And the tension between being a leader and being seen by taking things, and then concluding by saying, what was on a lot of our minds, is China really going to confront the United States and its Western allies on Gaza? I think this is such an important point. Let me leave those for the other panelists to also reference, because I think you raised some profoundly important questions. And let me now, in the interest of time, if you don't mind, go to our next speaker, and then I'll come back to you as well. So our next speaker is Professor Niao from my home country. Selamat Petang, Abang. So over to you to give a Southeast Asian perspective on China's role, and as an academic who've looked at this very seriously in what Pankaj refers to in some contested areas. China's relationship is good with most ASEAN countries, but there are bumps along the road with contested disputes and all of that, but no wars. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Chandran. Glad to be here. It's my honor to speak here as well. Okay, yeah. I think the big events a couple of maybe last week, yeah, just not long ago, was the military parade, along with the theme of this victory of the anti-fascist war. China labeled the world anti-fascist war. And I think about 7 or 8 leaders of the ASEAN countries attended, either head of government, head of states, or maybe a special representative, which in a way show that there is a relatively high degree of alignment, at least in certain views, between China and Southeast Asia. I think before that, there was this Shanghai Cooperation Organization SCO meeting in Tianjin, where the Prime Minister of my own country also attended, along with a few selected leaders of ASEAN countries as well. And in the Tianjin SCO meeting, it was Chinese leader Xi Jinping also announced a new initiative, the Global Governance Initiative, to go along with the 3 initiatives that have been mentioned before. I suppose everyone is familiar with those: development, security, and civilization. So the general overwhelming framing in the Western discourses on this is that China is aligning or bringing along its buddies or whatever it is, right, for an anti or Western bloc or whatever. But this is a very, very serious misreading of the kind of messages and the kind of alignments or the worldviews that exist not just in China but also in Southeast Asian countries, but I also suppose also in many other countries who send their leaders to attend the parade and who also participate in some of the meetings of SCO and also BRICS. It is not about being anti-West. It is about trying to reconfigure and reimagine different political order that is different from today, but actually more aligned or more similar to the original aspiration and vision that came out of the aftermath of the World War II. The aftermath of World War II was a very powerful vision when countries came together. There was a decolonization movement. There were a lot more countries yearning for their own autonomy, their determination to chart their own national pathway, to cooperate with each other. They're not rejecting the West. They needed the West as a partner, but not as a condensing formal governments to just continue to take care of this. They want a genuine partnership. I think all this basically, whether it's the parade, it's the SCO meeting, the global governance initiative, and so on and so forth, fundamentally, there is this message about equal, mutually beneficial partnership that China is presenting and that is being accepted, at least being accepted in a high degree by many countries in the developing world, or what we call in the global south. I once wrote an article about the comparative or the contrast of actually I should just call it contrast, right? Comparing community of shared destiny or a community of a common future. It's called a community of shared future. And then the liberal international order. These are kind of the 2 major constructs, and how Malaysia looks at these 2 narratives is published in Carnegie, which I'm a non-resident scholar there, which I argue that actually there is not a kind of a binary worldview about these 2. Malaysia was born in a setting where they were very comfortable with the Western order, liberal international order, but it doesn't see the community of shared destiny that is coming out of China as something that is fundamentally challenging. It's recalibrating for sure. It is trying to reform and make it much more equitable, much more beneficial to many of the countries in the global south, rather than a direct assault, a direct contrast, or a binary like it is often portrayed in the West. When global development initiative was announced, it will say, oh, this is a debt trap, this is a different from how the West is doing things in terms of aid and development. And then the global security initiative was announced, or this was portrayed as a China trying to develop its own network of alliances and so on and so forth. And civilization initiative is to pop up basically non-Western, basically non-democratic governance model and so on and so forth. But this is fundamentally a misreading of all these messages, I would say. Because these are basically read as something, I think, not just in Malaysia, but in many countries in the global south, as actually going back to the roots of, based on the United Nations, based on the equal participation of the member countries in the world. It's a democratization of the international relations more than actually trying to bring a sword to an international, liberal international order, so to speak. So I think that is fundamentally what China, why the alignment of views between China and at least I would say quite a number of countries in the global south is all about. It's not about anti-Western alliance. It's not about trying to build a new bloc, but actually a much more equitable and mutually beneficial international system and order. I will just stop here in the interest of time also, but I'm happy to continue to engage. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Miao. Really interesting about the two different models that you talked about, and it's not a binary choice. And I think it's great to cite a sort of middle income country like Malaysia, which was born out of, the decolonization process, adopted that, but doesn't see the Chinese model or the new formations as something that is completely opposed to that. So I think this is a really important point. I will try and get your paper and circulate it to the audience as well. So I'll get the team here to circulate it as well. So thank you very much. In the interest of time, I'll move on to our next speaker, Professor Wendelbusch. Wendelbusch. I hope I have pronounced your name properly, Professor. But you're a highly experienced professor, teacher, and practitioner in mediation and international law. So I think, and coming from a European perspective as well, it will be really important for us to understand how you see the topic that we're discussing and what your main points are for this discussion. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. This has been a very rich conversation so far, so I'm very glad to add some more to this. I've been based also in China for a very long time at the Shanghai Jiaotong University before moving back to Europe, where I was an international legal scholar focusing on China's normative conduct on the international plane. So looking at how it sees the application of international norms, which are international institutions are using, right, to govern international problems, right? Problems ranging from security, development, trade, as well as humanitarian affairs, right? And we see there that China takes up a relational perspective, right? So it means that international norms do not simply apply into a vacuum, right? I mean, they have to be applied to a number of competing parties, right? And in order for international norms to gain a root, right, they need a fertile soil in which those norms can resort their binding effect, right? So I think the example regarding humanitarian intervention, for example, or the operationalization of R2P is quite interesting, right? Because there we see that China has taken, for example, different stances, right, which may seem to be contradictory, right? On the one hand, in the case of Libya, it abstained, right, regarding the US and jointly led mission together with NATO and other Gulf countries to attack certain facilities, right, in Libya, which in the end, in the aftermath of the conflict, triggered also a regime change. Hence also the distaste, let's say, of this approach. But on the other hand, we also see that in light of the crisis in Ivory Coast, right, where we had a sitting president which lost the election, right, and refused to step down, that China approved in favor, right? So it did not abstain, but it approved in favor of operationalizing R2P in that country. So what makes it that different, right? And what I argue, it's the relationships, right, are different, right? Because the stage in which relationships have been aligned, either between the members of the Security Council, were in order, right? There was a common view that we have to respect the wishes of the peoples of Ivory Coast following the democratic elections. And on the other hand, we also see that regionally speaking too, the regional organization of West African states also was supportive of this military intervention. So we have a regional dimension which has been ticked off. So the relationships were also aligned over there. And also domestically, right, we wanted to, of course, respect the wishes of the peoples of Ivory Coast. So this is an interesting example because it really demonstrates seemingly two opposing normative stances of China regarding the application of international norms related to some type of humanitarian intervention. But all of this alignment obviously takes time, right? And it also requires restraint, as we pointed out. You cannot add more oil to the fire because this can compromise, obviously, the engagement, the dialogue with the different parties at the table, right? Both decision makers, right, which have their pre-negotiation on how to position oneself, but also, of course, the parties concerned, let's say, on the so-called battlefield. And often we've seen also that China really expresses very clearly that it's important that we don't put unnecessary external pressure, right, on those negotiations which take place between interested parties on the battlefield, and that we have to let the internal dynamics play their own role. Right? The question, of course, here is, to what extent do we need to wait for those internal dynamics to lead to a conclusive answer, right, in governing a particular conflict, right, and having international norms to be applicable to those conflicts, right, even though this may be into the internal affairs of some nations, right. We do have international norms which can become applicable within domestic contexts as well. I'm thinking here as well, in particular related to rules governing humanitarian access, right? And I think this also links back to the current crisis in Gaza as well. How long would China, for example, also wait for the internal dynamics to be at play in order to agree that humanitarian access as an international norm should be guaranteed, right? I think was pointed out in the previous talk as well. There may be other relational issues, right, which are at stake, right? Does it want to confront the US? Does it want to confront other allies of Israel? So this is, of course, a predicament, right? How much suffering, right, can we allow eventually to find alignment of different interests, alignment of different views on a particular conflict? Importantly, of course, in that process of finding alignment, it may be useful to have appropriate mediators taking a role, right, in finding a proper solution to the conflict. But from a mediation point of view, we often seem to be stuck on focusing ourselves on the punctual demands which are on the table, right? And we tend to forget to dig deeper, right, and bring to the surface the underlying interests which are really at play, right? Interest at play on the side of the decision makers, interest at play at the side of the parties to a particular conflict. And that requires a number of skills, right, which may not be necessarily deployed by current mediators. But it's an essential step, right, to establish recognition on either side of the conflict, but also, and as a result, mutual recognition as well. And once it's there, then you can also look more closely at identifying common interest around which eventually you will be exploring different options, right, in solving the problem, and potentially also have international norms become applicable, so that in the end they can govern a particular conflict, right? And as again, this applies both in trade, security, or humanitarian affairs. I think I will leave it here, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Professor. I think the key point here you were making was the relationship perspective, and you used the Libya and the Nigeria one. And I think people can come to different conclusions about both relationships, but also this sort of message that made by others that the China's interest in all of this would be to play it safe. The Nigeria was most safe because they had the support of the majority of the African countries, etc. The Libya one might have been seen as more supporting Western intervention. So I think this is an important one. So we have about 10, 15 minutes left. So I want to ask a couple of questions. We've already had, I think, a very rich discussion. So I'll start with you, Professor Van Holbush, to go back to Dr. Tate's question, which I think in a way also captures much of what we've been trying to discuss. And then I'd like all the other panelists to also come in on this. In just a minute or so, a couple of minutes, how do you respond to his point that China can make a change if it wants to, but it doesn't yet seem to want to, because for all the reasons of playing safe and all the things that Dr. Jin and others spoke about? So what is your response to his thing about, and using Gaza now as, top of mind? I mean, we're all aghast at what's happening. So I just wondered if you could respond to that in a couple of minutes. And then I'd like to invite all the other panelists to also respond. And I'll come back to you, Dr. Tate, and what you think this responses have looked like and how would you respond to that? Over to you, Professor Walter Bush.
Thank you very much. Well, from an international legal point of view, right, combining relational governance, as I demonstrate in the cases regarding R2P operationalization, I think what China is concerned with, right, that international norms on the long term survive, right? So if we too quickly, right, too abruptly, without negotiation, right, and agreement, right, call for a very black and white letter application of the law, right? And in the end, it doesn't find application, right? It's not respected, right? That in itself, right, erodes the binding force of international norms, right? So that's one thing, right? This is a precaution, right? Let's say a cautious attitude regarding when we govern with international norms. Well, if we agree on their application, right, we have to make sure they also apply it in the end, right? If they are not applied, well, then we defeat ourselves, right? And then the international legal order as such is at stake. The second part of the question related. Can you remind it again? Sorry, I lost my thought here.
The second point of what I said is, what should China do with regard to Gaza, given what Dr. Tate said, that we're all witnessing what I think is now most of the world recognizes as a genocide, right? On our TV screens. And his point is, if China wanted, it could change something. But you, as a negotiator, international law expert, is it possible to do something as a power like China? What can it do? Because it has no space to intervene within the sort of so-called diplomatic circle in these circumstances. So very quickly, how do you see this? Could it do anything, to his point, Dr. Tate's point, that if it wanted, it could do more? But what could it do under the current circumstances?
I'm afraid that's a bit tied to the current dynamics, right? The internal dynamics on the one hand, and also the current mediators which are on the table, right? So if indeed there's a call on behalf of the parties to the conflict to look for an alternative mediator, right? And this is something, of course, in any mediation process is important. You need to trust your mediator, right? So if the parties to the conflict here do not trust the US or Qatar or Egypt as well, well, then they may have to look at another party. So the demands should actually come from the parties themselves to the conflict, right? And then it opens potentially the floor for China to step in.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So can I, those same questions and anything else in the next 10 minutes, can I ask Dr. Jiang, how would you respond to that challenge? Does China want to do more? If it wants, it could change many things. Or you think there are constraints and it's playing it carefully for a very good reason?
It's clear that Chinese diplomats feel very emotional and very painful about the situation in Gaza and called for changes. But yes, the results have been limited. The question is, I think China sees this as basically an invasion, genocide by Israel, supported and sponsored by the US and some Western allies. So the question is, how much leverage does China have on Israel? They have had good economic relations. They have had a shared history of protecting Jews in the Second World War. But then how much beyond that? You could say that maybe China is a bit limited by its principle against sanctions. China's always said that economic sanctions have shown that they don't work and they disservice, and China is against unilateral solutions. So China's been trying to work its way through the UN. But then the UN hasn't been very effective. But I think I have noted that China, I think, was the first major nation to mention the two-state solution at the beginning of the conflict. I think that was a brave and that was a statement.
Thank you, Dr. Jiang. Very, very good point about the constraints and the relationships. Dr. Jin, what is your take and response to what you've heard and the general thesis that does China want to do more to be the international global power, and in the context of Gaza, could it do Can it do more, or is it essentially difficult for any power, not just China?
I totally agree with Dr. Zhang. China actually really wish the crisis could be solved under the UN framework within the international law. Actually, China has united with a lot of countries. For example, China has joined the so-called New York Declaration, that is to promote the two-state solution. But the key factor, and also as regards to sanctions, as Dr. Zhang has said, we never think that is effective. And today, if you look at the dynamic there, it seems that the U.S. itself couldn't have enough, couldn't have a final say or decisive say in resolving the crisis. So I think China would like to do more. China would like to take more, positive or active steps to handle the crisis, humanitarian crisis. But it's really, it's really depending on the global joint efforts, especially the U.S. as a most important actor in the region to play more responsible role.
Thank you, Dr. Jin. So, Dr. Niao, and then I'm going to come to Dr. Tate. Dr. Niao, everyone says China wants to play this role, and this comes back to the China-US relationships. And using Gaza as the unfortunate sort of focus of our attentions at the moment. But we know that the US is completely aligned and essentially complicit in the genocide. So then what role for China or anybody else? But we are talking about China. And do you see that China could do more, or the real politics is that China can't do anything more? And then I'd like to ask Dr. Tate to tell us, in his view, what should China do, and then try and close this thing off. Over to you, Professor. Yeah.
Well, in my view and my understanding of the way that China look at this issue, of course, the best option would be that it will be resolved according to your UN framework under international law, exactly. But if there is any leading organization or body where China will safely say that they will be the supportive actor, then it will be the regional countries. There, it seems like China is hoping that there will be a strong enough regional body that would take charge in being at the front stage in resolving this issue, rather than China jumping over the regional countries and become the outside powers that dominate the issue and become the primary solution. That was exactly what the US has been doing, not entirely successful, and in fact, in China's eyes, basically it's not very successful at all. And China basically wanted to avoid that. So I think that is partly the reason why China has been reluctant, but there will be basically much more forthcoming if there is a strong enough regional organization or entity that provides solutions. I say this because it's in the context of Southeast Asia, there is also a major crisis, not to the extent of the genocide in Palestine, in Gaza, of course, but there's the Myanmar crisis. And there have been a lot of question marks in the region, also whether China could step up to be one of the major solution providers to the Myanmar issue. But China so far, again, I would say is relatively reluctant. You could do, someone say micro steps, exactly. China is doing discrete micro steps here and there to facilitate certain delivery of humanitarian aids here and there. But China is not going to leap over ASEAN. I have spoken to many Chinese counterparts that say that this is ASEAN issue. If ASEAN step up, China will step up to back you up. But if ASEAN, you are not stepping up, it's illogical to ask China to step up. That is exactly, I think, one of their conventional thinking that are still prevalent in the minds of Beijing policymakers.
Thank you, Dr. Niao. Very good point. So in the Gaza situation, you're saying the Arab countries, the surrounding countries, if they had a strong coalition that invited, and coming back to Professor Van Holberg's point, that you need to have trusted mediators or enough of a coalition, then you might be able to do it. Then China might intervene, might get involved. Dr. Tate, what is your take on these responses by everyone? And in your world, what would be the invitation as a Palestinian and as an analyst that you would provide to China?
Thank you. Thank you so much. All these are really great and very relevant and thought-provoking points. Maybe very quick three points. I think the global majority now, they are looking for a new leader in this world. And this is why the expectations are, and this is why the micro steps are not fulfilling these aspirations. Again, we mentioned earlier all the challenges there, but I think this is one of my starting points. But I think the second point, what is key in all of this, is building a coalition. And this is why I mentioned it earlier, and now a number of colleagues mentioned it here. But China needs to co-lead or lead that coalition, not alone, but clearly with other actors to create a new global order. And here, Palestine and Gaza offers a test. And that test is really crucial to see if this global order stands, because the global order that we have, the rule-based approach, that whole approach failed in this Gaza test. So what can we do to challenge that and to create something different? And China has a number of entry points and leverages. It's not a question of if it has leverage on Israel or not, in my opinion. It is how it can instrumentalize the leverage that it has in the region, especially in the Gulf, and the economic leverage that is there to reshape the region that is evolving. So coalition and building a coalition is important, because at the end of the day, a global leader creates space. It doesn't wait for a space to be open for this global leader. You're a global leader, you create that space. If you tell me that this global leader is finding refuge in the UN institution, I'm sorry, for me, that is not a global leader, as we just said over the past hour. We know that the UN institution is not an institution that is there to deliver. Of course, in theory, it is there to deliver justice and peace and global security and all of this. But in reality, when it comes to implementation, it's not the case. So if a global power finds refuge in a dysfunctional institution, a Security Council that is not delivering peace and global security, then we have another larger tension that we need to deal with. And if we have a problem here with sanctions and it's not effective, then what about accountability? Do we take accountability seriously or not? And that's really the other challenge that I would like to put on the table. So it's not scarcity of entry points or scarcity of idea. It's really, we go back to the political will and going further with creating a new world order, and Gaza offers the test.
Perfect, Dr. Tate. And to all the panelists, I want to come back to you with questions, but my time is up. So I hope you will forgive me for not engaging you even more. We have a bit more time. Okay, I've just been told we got a bit more time. So one of the questions I like to ask is, we have here a discussion that I think, in my view, as someone who tries and follows these discussions, is very, very, very unique. The idea is that China is not imperialist. It can play an important role. But Dr. Tate said, using Gaza, that China must grab the opportunity and build that global order. So can I start again go through everyone again and ask starting with Dr. Zhang. We know the Chinese principles of non-intervention and all of that, but if you were advising, and I say this in a very honest manner, if you were advising the Chinese government today in this context of this discussion we've had, and particularly given the dire state of things and using Palestine as that focus, is there something from a departure from the conservative step-by-step view that China could do? And even using the ASEAN-Myanmar issue, where Dr. Niao said, it wants to be cautious and not over-jumping regional partners. What do you think it's an expert China could do? Because the current status quo, we all know, is painfully inadequate. And China is the only one possibly who could do something. So if you were advising, and that's the question for everyone, we'll go around, what would you say?
Yes, yeah, I've been thinking also since also the conflict in Ukraine and some other regional conflicts that what China could have done more. I think China has been in a learning process as well. And there is a question whether China is ready to accept the role of a global leadership and not be viewed as a global hegemon. I think when it comes to Middle East and North Africa, China doesn't want to be deeply involved in the security and ethnic and religious conflicts because I don't think China believes it can resolve those conflicts. And China has been promoting development as the root solution to conflicts, but we can see that in some situations where other tensions are high, then it's not a short-term solution. In the past, China has experimented with methods that goes beyond its principle. For example, to negotiate with both parties, it has offered to host meetings between conflicting parties in Beijing, sometimes successful, sometimes not successful. And when it comes to the question of security guarantee, like Ukraine has asked of China, China could also have considered this option, even though it doesn't want this sort of military alliance kind of relationship. So China has used such methods before. And if China feels more secure that other countries, both Western and non-Western countries, see its proactiveness or activeness not as a rising hegemon, as imposing its power, but taking responsibility, maybe China will become more bold to take such steps.
Professor Jiang, very thoughtful. And when you write your next paper addressing this question, please make sure you let us know. I think there'll be great interest in this question that we've all started to talk about. Professor Jiang, Jin, to you, Professor Jiang said that China doesn't want to get involved in these things. But what Dr. Tate is saying is it has to get involved in these things. So is there a need for ideological shift? You're a researcher, an expert in this. Is it naive to assume that China should get involved? But by not getting involved, is it essentially emboldening the bad actors of today, which Pankaj very clearly outlined, which includes the United States, knowing that we can do whatever we want because there's nobody who can stop us?
Actually, China's role in the world today is growing and developing within the current system. So for a long time, China has been facing a kind of dilemma to take the so-called correct role in the world. On one side, there is great expectations for China to play a more important role, as our panelist has argued. But on the other side, whatever China do has been arousing high suspicion. It's very important to keep a kind of balance for China to play the constructive role within the system. If you look at what kind of order China would like to have in the current transformation, you could read from the new launched Global Governance Initiative. You could see China actually speak high of the system we have ever had. That is the principles we have to follow, the international role we have to be committed. And also we have to continue, operate within the multilateral system. And of course, you maybe have noticed China take another principle into the consideration. That is the result-oriented principle and the people-centered principle. All of this actually means China would like to take actions to improve the efficiency of the multilateral institutions. But as I've said at the very beginning, as regards to the conflicts, the crises, I agree with a lot of panelists talking about the role of the regional organizations. So that is in line with our principle of sovereignty and ownership of different regions and different countries. I think that is our vision of the evolving global system.
Thank you. So 30 seconds each. Professor Walhorn-Busch, 30 seconds. What's your take on China? Is China just being too cautious? Does it have to be bolder in 30 seconds or please.
Any order or any new order, right, has to be built on trust, which is currently lacking in the present configurations, right, even at the regional level. So I think I would start there, right, in restoring the relationships between the different regional actors, right, and then try to build more bridges, right, between those different regions as well, because we live in a multipolar world. So the international system as such will not be totally reinvented, but let's try to build trust, and on that basis, right, we can maybe think about the next phase, right, and seeing what kind of international norms can also govern each other, right, on the international plane. But starting with that would be a good attempt.
Thank you. Professor Niao, 30 seconds. What is your take? Should China be bolder? Is it too cautious? Or is it part of an evolving role as it gets more trust, it builds more coalitions? What's your take?
All right, I will make 2 points. The first point, I think China often look at US as a kind of the model, I mean the alternative, right? In a sense that it doesn't want to repeat the US mistakes.
Right, okay.
So if it's very cautious to get involved because it views that this is exactly what it shouldn't follow, that make it more cautious. I think the second point I want to make is that I think there has been very clear successful examples of China's successfully mediating the resolution of a particular conflict. There is no good precedent experience for China to think that this is something that we are actually good at. They don't feel they are very confident and good in doing this. There was some, the Iran-Saudi is kind of a tentative thing. Nobody really know how sustainable and how long it's going to work. In the past, there was a Cambodian crisis in the 1980s that China was part of the solution, but it was part of the larger, together with ASEAN and the US and many others. So I don't think China feel that it has any successful example for it to show that I can actually do more, rather than just stick to the very cautious way of looking at these conflicts.
Thank you, Dr. Niao. And Dr. Chate, you got 30 seconds to please final word on what you've heard from everybody.
Well, this is a very historic moment that we see here. It's not a moment like before, thinking of Gaza, thinking of what's been happening over the past 2 years. So it is not a question of it's a conflict that we need to invite mediators to come and solve that conflict. It's not like that. This is not an invitation for mediators to come in. What we've been seeing requires from a global power like China to take this as a moral, legal, political, and human duty.
Wonderful, Dr. Tate. I think you've challenged us all. You've also helped us to get valuable contributions that everyone has made here to suggest that there is a whole new sort of way of thinking about China's role. And I hope all of you will write some papers around it to tell us about it, because I think this is a new area of discussion we need to have. What does it do? And everyone's contributions have been really important. What we're going to do now is actually spotlight all the speakers so we can take a shot and tell the whole world that we were all together here. And allow me to then just say to everyone, thanks a million for being with us. We've had a wonderful interaction. As someone who does this a fair bit, I've rarely seen the kind of issues being brought together. I hope I've done a fairly good job of bringing it together to get you all to express your opinions. I hope that this also triggers some new areas of inquiry, given that you're all also in academia, etc. And I know I hope the audience has been watching, learned a great deal. I certainly learned a great deal from this. So thank you very much, everyone. And we will be in touch with all of you. Thank you. Peace to everybody. Thank you.